Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the vast ocean below. The waves crash against the rocks, and the wind howls in your ears. You feel a sense of power and majesty, but also a sense of danger and uncertainty. This is how John Calvin felt about the world around him. The 16th century was a time of great change, and for Calvin, it was like standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure of what lay ahead. The world was in turmoil. The medieval order, which had stood for centuries, was crumbling. New ideas were sweeping through Europe, challenging old beliefs and traditions. The Protestant Reformation, led by figures like Martin Luther and Calvin himself, was shaking the foundations of the Christian Church. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on human reason and classical learning, was reshaping how people thought about the world. The discovery of new lands and the spread of new technologies were expanding the horizons of human knowledge and experience. Calvin, a French theologian and pastor, was at the heart of this upheaval. He saw the chaos and confusion around him, but he also saw something else. He saw a world that was still under the control of a sovereign God, a God who had created everything and who continued to guide and direct it. For Calvin, the natural order was not just a chaotic mess, but a theater where God's glory was displayed. Calvin believed that the world was a stage and God was the director. Every part of creation, from the smallest grain of sand to the largest mountain, was designed to show God's power and wisdom. The stars in the sky, the plants in the fields, and the animals in the forests were all part of a grand performance. They were not random or meaningless, but carefully crafted to reveal God's character. For Calvin, the natural order was not something to be feared or avoided. It was a place where God's presence could be seen and felt. When people looked at the beauty of a sunset or the complexity of a flower, they were seeing God's handiwork. When they experienced the harmony of nature, they were experiencing God's order. But Calvin also knew that the world was not perfect. The fall of humanity had brought sin and disorder into creation. The once perfect order had been disrupted, and the world was now a place of struggle and suffering. Yet, even in the midst of this brokenness, God's presence could still be seen. The natural order, though flawed, was still a reflection of God's goodness and power. Calvin's view of the natural order was deeply influenced by his understanding of the fall. According to Calvin, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, they not only brought sin into their own lives, but also into the entire created order. The world, which had been created good, became a place of decay and corruption. The once harmonious relationship between humans and nature was broken. The earth itself was cursed, and the animals became hostile. But for Calvin, the fall did not mean that the natural order was completely destroyed. It was still a creation of God, and God's presence could still be seen in it. The natural order, though fallen, was still a theater where God's glory could be displayed. The beauty of a flower, the complexity of a cell, and the vastness of the universe were all testaments to God's power and wisdom, even in a world marred by sin. At the heart of Calvin's understanding of the natural order was the doctrine of providence. Providence is the idea that God is actively involved in the world, guiding and directing all things according to his will. Calvin believed that God's providence was like the proscenium arch of a theater. It framed and shaped the performance of the natural order. For Calvin, God's providence was not just a passive oversight. God was actively involved in every aspect of creation, from the smallest events to the largest. He controlled the weather, the seasons, and the movements of the planets. He guided the actions of people, animals, and even the forces of nature. Everything that happened in the world was part of God's plan, and nothing could happen outside of his control. But Calvin also believed in the reality of secondary causes. Secondary causes are the natural laws and processes that God has established in the world. For example, when a seed grows into a plant, it is not because God directly causes each cell to divide, but because God has designed the seed to grow according to natural laws. Calvin saw this as a way for God to show his wisdom and power. God's providence worked through these natural processes, ensuring that the world continued to function in an orderly and predictable way. For Calvin, the natural order was not just a collection of random events and processes. It was a carefully designed and ordered system, reflecting God's wisdom and power. This order was not just a theoretical concept. It had practical implications for how people lived their lives. Calvin believed that understanding the natural order was essential for living a life that honored God. People needed to recognize that the world was not chaotic, but ordered, and that this order was a reflection of God's character. By living in harmony with this order, people could better understand and appreciate God's presence in their lives. This emphasis on order was also important for Calvin's view of human society. Calvin believed that the natural order extended to human relationships and institutions. Just as the natural world was ordered, so too should human society be ordered. This included the family, the church, and the state. Each of these institutions had a role to play in God's plan, and people needed to understand and fulfill their roles within these institutions. Calvin was acutely aware of the threats to this order. He saw many people in his time rejecting the traditional teachings of the church and embracing new, often heretical ideas. Some denied the existence of God or the authority of Scripture. Others believed that nature was a force to be mastered and controlled, rather than a reflection of God's glory. Calvin saw these ideas as a threat to the order of creation and to the well-being of society. Calvin was particularly concerned about the ideas of the libertines, a group of radical thinkers who rejected traditional moral and religious constraints. They believed that people should be free to do whatever they wanted, without regard for God's law or the well-being of others. Calvin saw this as a dangerous and destructive idea, one that threatened to undermine the order of creation and lead to chaos and disorder. As Calvin stood on the edge of the cliff, looking out at the tumultuous world below, he held firmly to his belief in God's providence and the order of creation. For him, the natural order was not a random collection of events and processes, but a carefully designed and ordered system reflecting God's glory. In a world of chaos and change, Calvin found hope and stability in the belief that God was still in control. In the chapters that follow, we will explore Calvin's understanding of the natural order in more detail. We will look at his views on angels, human nature, natural law, and the redemption of the cosmos. We will see how Calvin's emphasis on order and providence shaped his theology and his approach to the world around him. But for now, let us remember that for Calvin, the natural order was a theater where God's glory was displayed, a stage where the drama of creation and redemption was played out. Calvin's teachings on creation and providence are deeply intertwined. He believed that the world and everything in it didn't have an inherent stability or order on its own. Instead, God's constant presence and guidance keep everything from falling into chaos. This belief is central to Calvin's understanding of how God interacts with the world and how the world reflects God's glory. Calvin's ideas about creation and providence evolved over time, but they didn't fundamentally change. Instead, he became more detailed and emphatic about certain themes. For example, he often talked about how the beauty of nature reveals God's wisdom, power, and goodness. In his early writings, Calvin described the natural world as a divine revelation, showing that God's glory is visible in the thunder, lightning, sea, and earth. He believed that these natural wonders are not just beautiful, but are also signs of God's ongoing care and governance. Calvin also emphasized the importance of natural law and the role it plays in society. He believed that humans are naturally social beings, and that the state is a necessary structure for maintaining order. He argued that the laws of society and the dictates of conscience are impressed in everyone's heart by God. This means that even people who don't know about the Bible or haven't heard about God still have a sense of right and wrong. Calvin saw this as evidence of God's presence and care, even in the most basic aspects of human life. One of the most significant themes in Calvin's writing is his belief in God's providence. He strongly opposed the idea that God is distant or uninvolved in the world. Instead, Calvin argued that God is actively involved in every detail of the universe and human history. This belief was particularly important in his debates with groups like the Epicureans, who thought God was uninterested in human affairs, and the Stoics, who believed in a rigid fate. Calvin insisted that God's providence means that nothing happens by chance. Every event, no matter how small, is part of God's plan. Calvin's understanding of providence also influenced his views on the afterlife and the role of angels. He believed that human souls are immortal, and that angels play a significant role in God's governance of the world. These ideas were developed in response to various challenges, such as those from the Anabaptists and the Libertines, who had different views on the nature of the soul and the existence of angels. Calvin's emphasis on God's providence and the goodness of creation extended to his belief that God's plan includes the restoration of all things. He saw the world as a theater where God's glory is displayed, and he believed that even after the fall of humanity, God's original purpose for creation remains intact. This means that God is not only concerned with individual salvation, but also with the preservation and ultimate restoration of the entire creation. Calvin's teachings on creation and providence were not just abstract ideas. They had practical implications for how Christians should live. He believed that believers are called to be active participants in God's plan, working to build up the church, govern society, and care for the natural world. All of these activities are part of God's ongoing work of preserving and restoring creation. Calvin's ideas about creation and providence were shaped by his interactions with various philosophical and theological traditions. He drew from the early church fathers, such as Irenaeus and Chrysostom, who defended the goodness of creation and the reality of God's providence. Irenaeus, for example, argued that God's plan of salvation includes the restoration of the entire creation, not just human souls. Chrysostom, on the other hand, emphasized the beauty and order of nature as evidence of God's providence, even in the face of suffering and injustice. Calvin's writings on providence also reflect his engagement with contemporary debates. He often addressed the concerns of his time, such as the resurgence of Epicureanism and Stoicism, and the challenges posed by Anabaptists and Libertines. Through his commentaries on the Bible and his sermons, Calvin developed a rich and nuanced understanding of how God's providence works in the world. His teachings continue to influence Christian thought and provide a framework for understanding God's role in creation and human history. Chrysostom, a key figure in early Christian theology, emphasized the incomprehensibility of God as a defense of divine providence. He believed that God is so high and distant that human reason cannot grasp his purposes or designs. Even the angels, who are closer to God than humans, cannot fully understand God's mysterious providence. Chrysostom taught that we should avoid trying to find the reasons behind human events and instead trust in God's infinite wisdom. He quoted from the Bible saying, "We see now only in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face." This means that in the afterlife we will finally understand God's ways. But for now, we must have faith and believe that God's revelation is more trustworthy than what we can see with our eyes. St. Augustine, another influential Christian thinker, also wrestled with the concepts of creation and providence. He wrote extensively on these topics, particularly in his work De Genesis ad Litteram. One of the questions Augustine had to address was, what was God doing before he created the world? The Manichees, a religious group, often mocked this question. Augustine found an answer by combining 3 biblical passages. He argued that God, who is eternal, created everything at once, outside of time. This means that before creation, there was no time as we understand it. Augustine believed that God is the only one who truly is, and that he stands above the changing and temporal universe. Augustine also explained that God created all plants, animals, and vegetation simultaneously, but they existed in a potential form called causal reasons. These causal reasons contained the seeds of all future life and development. For example, the causal reasons for trees and animals were present in the primal elements of the world from the beginning. As time passed, these reasons unfolded and developed into the plants and animals we see today. Augustine believed that nothing in Scripture is superfluous or erroneous. He argued that the 2 creation stories in Genesis, the first chapter and the second chapter, teach different truths. The first story describes the simultaneous, non-temporal creation, while the second story narrates the beginning of the real temporal development of the world. Augustine used the concept of causal reasons to explain how God's creation is both complete and continually unfolding. Augustine also discussed the role of angels in God's providence. He believed that angels carry out God's commands in the course of history, acting as intermediaries between God and the world. This allowed Augustine to explain how God remains immutable and eternal while still being involved in the temporal world. According to Augustine, God's providence operates in a linear, irreversible time, starting with the act of creation and continuing through history. In the 13th century, the reintroduction of beliefs in the eternity of the world and the restriction of providence challenged these fundamental doctrines. The Averroist controversy and the rediscovery of Aristotle's writings on nature forced Christian thinkers to defend God's creation and providence. Saint Bonaventure and Saint Thomas Aquinas were among those who refuted Averroistic theories. Bonaventure warned against the belief that the world is eternal and that God cannot create from nothing. He argued that these ideas led to the denial of divine providence over individual things. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologiae, defended the Christian doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, arguing that the creation of the world cannot be demonstrated but must be accepted on the basis of revelation. He also emphasized that God's providence is necessary to preserve the world in existence. Aquinas explained that creatures do not have the reason for their existence within themselves and must participate in God's being. This participation means that all things depend on God for their existence and are governed by His providence. Aquinas also argued that God has immediate providence over all things and uses secondary causes, such as human will, celestial bodies, and angels to govern the world. He believed that God's knowledge and providence extend to every individual thing, not just general species. This means that everything in the world is directed by God to a specific end. The Averroistic views were condemned in the Parisian condemnations of 1270 and 1277. These condemnations rejected the idea that all events are determined by the heavenly bodies and that God does not know or govern individual things. Later, medieval nominalist thinkers, such as Pierre Dary, emphasized the contingent and dependent nature of creation. They stressed that God's power is free and omnipotent, and that the created order is radically contingent. However, they also believed that God has committed to act in accordance with the structures He has established, making the created order both contingent and reliable. John Calvin, a key figure in the Reformation, also affirmed the creation of the world ex nihilo. He believed that God created the world through the Word, who is the Son of God. Calvin taught that the entire Trinity was involved in the act of creation. He also emphasized the role of the Holy Spirit in sustaining the world before it was formed. Calvin defended the biblical account of creation against those who mocked the idea that God suddenly decided to create the world after being inactive. He cited Augustine's arguments against such ideas and stressed the importance of faith and trust in God's providence. Calvin believed that Augustine, a famous early Christian thinker, made a mistake when interpreting the book of Genesis. Augustine thought that God created everything all at once, but Calvin thought this was wrong. He pointed out that Genesis chapter 1, verse 5 talks about the first day, which shows that God took time to create the world over several days, not all at once. Calvin believed that God did this to help us understand and appreciate His work. God made things in steps, so that we could see and think about each part of His creation. When Calvin talked about God's ongoing care for the world, which he called Providence, he was often responding to people who disagreed with him. He saw that in the 1500s, some people were challenging the idea that God was actively involved in the world. Calvin didn't always name his opponents, but he was clear that he thought they were making serious mistakes. One group Calvin argued against was the Stoics. The Stoics were ancient philosophers who believed that everything in the world was part of a natural order, and that this order was controlled by a kind of universal spirit. Calvin thought this was a problem because it made God too much a part of the world, almost like God was just another part of nature. This led to the idea that everything that happened was determined and that humans had no real choice or responsibility. Calvin strongly rejected this. He believed that God is separate from the world and that He has a plan. But He also allows people to make choices and be responsible for their actions. Calvin also opposed another group called the Libertines. The Libertines believed in a single divine spirit that controlled everything, which Calvin thought was similar to the Stoic idea. This belief led them to think that God was responsible for everything, including evil, and that people weren't really responsible for their actions. Calvin argued that this was wrong because it took away human responsibility and made God the author of sin. Calvin believed that God uses people and other parts of creation to carry out His plans, but people still have their own will and are responsible for their choices. On the other side, Calvin also argued against those who thought God was too distant from the world. He called these people Epicureans and Sophists. These thinkers believed that God created the world, but then left it to run on its own, like a clock that keeps ticking without any further intervention. Calvin thought this was wrong because it made God seem uninvolved and distant. He believed that God is actively involved in the world, guiding and caring for everything He created. Calvin's view was that God is both separate from the world and actively involved in it. God created the world and continues to care for it, but He also allows people and other parts of creation to have their own roles and responsibilities. This means that God is in control, but people still have free will and are responsible for their actions. Calvin believed that understanding this balance was crucial for living a life that honors God and respects the world he created. Calvin, the influential reformer, had a deep concern about the views of the universe and God that were spreading during his time. He was especially worried about the teachings of the Epicureans, who believed that the gods, while existing, had no interest in the world or its affairs. These gods, according to the Epicureans, were content to live in a state of perfect peace and were not involved in the creation or the daily events of the world. Calvin saw this view as a threat to the Christian understanding of God, who is actively involved in the world and cares deeply for creation. To combat these ideas, Calvin emphasized the concept of divine providence. He argued that God is not distant or uninvolved, but is constantly at work, sustaining and guiding the universe. Calvin believed that, without God's constant presence, the world would fall into chaos and disorder. This idea is rooted in his interpretation of Psalm 104, where he saw the psalmist describing how God's Spirit is necessary for life to exist and for the world to function. Calvin often pointed to the order and regularity found in nature as evidence of God's active role. For example, he marveled at the way the stars move in their paths without colliding, seeing this as a sign of God's power and wisdom. He saw the heavens as a grand display of God's work, a constant reminder that the universe is not random but is governed by a divine hand. Calvin also emphasized the fragility of the world. He believed that nature by itself is unstable and would quickly fall apart without God's sustaining power. He used the imagery of water to illustrate this point. According to Calvin, water is naturally lighter than the earth and should cover it, yet the earth remains dry because God miraculously holds the waters back. This, Calvin argued, is a daily miracle that shows God's constant care and intervention. In his commentary on the Bible, Calvin often returned to the idea that the world is precarious. He pointed out that the earth is a heavy mass floating in a vast universe, and without God's power, it would fall. He also noted that the waters above and below the earth are a constant threat, and only God's restraint keeps them from overwhelming the planet. The Great Flood, as described in the Bible, was a dramatic example of what happens when God allows these waters to break free. Calvin's view of the universe was deeply rooted in the belief that God is not just the creator, but also the sustainer of all things. The natural order, with its beauty and regularity, is a testament to God's ongoing care. At the same time, the world's fragility and the constant threat of chaos remind us of our dependence on God. For Calvin, every aspect of nature, from the orderly movement of the stars to the daily miracle of dry land, is a sign of God's presence and power. Basil, a wise man from ancient times, once told Christians not to spend too much time worrying about why the earth stays in its place. He believed that, like the great thinker Calvin would later say, "It's all because of God's power. If you think the earth is held up by air, you'd wonder how such a light and porous thing can support something so heavy. If you think it's water, you'd wonder how a heavier object can float on a lighter one. If you think there's something even heavier holding the earth, you'd then wonder what holds that thing. It's a never-ending puzzle." But Basil believed that, no matter the answer, we should remember that God is in control. The Bible says, "In the hand of God are all the ends of the earth." Calvin, a later thinker, agreed with Basil, but went a bit further. He believed that the earth rests on air and water, but he always came back to the idea that God's power is the real reason. In his explanation of Psalm chapter 104 verse 5, Calvin said that the earth hanging in the air and floating on water is a wonder. He thought that even though the earth is naturally the center of the world, it's God's power that keeps it stable. He asked, if the waters are lighter, why don't they cover the whole earth? The answer, he said, is that God's providence has arranged it so that there's a place for humans to live. In his sermons, Calvin was less interested in philosophical explanations. He saw the earth as a massive, heavy object that seems impossible to support. He thought it was hanging in the air and surrounded by water, and that only God's power could keep it in place. He said, if we look at the earth, what is it standing on? It's standing on water and air. We can't build a house 15 feet high without a foundation, but the earth is standing on something that could shift at any moment, so there must be a great power of God keeping it in place. Calvin believed that the beauty and order of nature are proof of God's presence. He saw nature as fragile and dependent on God's constant support. If God stopped supporting the earth, it would fall, and the waters would flood the land. He thought that the stability of nature shows God's joy in his creation. If God stopped being happy with his creation, it would fall into chaos. The fall of Adam and Eve made the world even more fragile. Before the fall, everything was in order, with humans in charge and animals submissive. But when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they disrupted the order. Calvin believed that the fall brought disorder into the world, making the earth less fertile and creating dangerous animals. He said that nature, which was once a source of comfort, now threatens human life. He thought that, without God's constant control, the world would be in constant chaos. Calvin saw the disorder in nature as a reflection of the moral disorder in human society. He believed that human sin had caused the world to become chaotic. He said that the world is full of floods of iniquity, that God must constantly hold back. He thought that wars, injustices, and revolutions are evidence of the moral disorder that entered the world after the fall. Calvin believed that God uses a bridle to control the forces of disorder. He said that God restrains the waters, the animals, and even the wicked to keep them from destroying the world. He believed that God's power is always at work, keeping the world from falling into complete chaos. He thought that God's control over the devil and the wicked is like a bridle that keeps them from doing too much harm. Calvin was also careful about how he talked about the laws of nature. He believed that God works through natural laws, but he didn't want people to think that nature could operate independently of God. He said that the sun doesn't rise and the rain doesn't fall just because of natural causes. God is always behind it. He believed that God gives nature its power and that nothing happens without God's plan. In Calvin's view, God is always in control, even when things seem chaotic. He believed that God's providence is like a hidden stability that keeps the world from falling apart. He thought that God's power is the reason the earth stays in its place, the waters don't flood the land, and the wicked don't destroy everything. Calvin's world was a dangerous place, but he believed that God's power was the only thing keeping it from falling into chaos. John Calvin, the famous reformer, often grappled with the idea of divine providence, especially when it came to explaining why bad things happen in the world. He was aware that nature and history don't always show God's perfect plan clearly. Calvin believed that while history can reflect God's providence, it often seems chaotic and full of disorder. This disorder can make it hard for people to see God's control over the world. Calvin used a passage from the Bible to illustrate this point. Go through the city streets, and you are subject to as many dangers as there are tiles on the roofs. If there is a weapon in your hand or friends, Harm awaits all the fierce animals you see are armed for your destruction. But if you try to shut yourself up in a walled garden, seemingly delightful, there are serpents sometimes lies hidden in your house, continually in danger of fire, threatens in the daytime to impoverish you, at night even to collapse upon you. Your field, since it is exposed to hail, frost, drought, and other calamities, threatens you with barrenness, and hence famine. I pass over poisonings, ambushes, robberies, open violence, which in part besiege us at home, in part dog us abroad. Amid these tribulations, must not man be most miserable, since but half alive in life he weakly draws his anxious and languid breath, as if he had a sword perpetually hanging over his neck. Calvin understood that it's not always clear that God is in control, restraining the wicked, and keeping the world in order. Many people think the world is governed by chance and that things happen randomly. But Calvin refused to accept this. He argued that providence is not something you can always see with your eyes. It's a belief based on faith in God's unchangeable nature. Calvin believed that God's attributes, His mercy, power, and justice, are the foundation of His providence. God's nature is to be merciful and just, and He cannot change that. Even if it seems like God is absent, He is always there, guiding and governing the world. Calvin often said that God cannot forget His office as the governor and judge of the world. God's power is what keeps the world from falling into chaos. It's what holds the waters back, keeps the stars in their courses, and restrains the wicked. Calvin also emphasized that God's power is not arbitrary or tyrannical. He rejected the idea that God could act in a way that is unjust or cruel. For Calvin, God's power is always guided by His wisdom and justice. This means that even when bad things happen, they are part of God's plan, and there is a reason behind them, even if we can't always understand it. Calvin's belief in God's immutability or unchangeability was crucial. He argued that God's nature is constant, and He cannot change. This means that God will always be the same, and He will always care for His creation. Calvin saw this as a source of comfort for believers. Knowing that God is in control, even when things seem out of control, gives people peace and assurance. For Calvin, the idea that God is in control of everything, even the bad things, was better than believing that the world is governed by chance or blind fortune. He thought it was better to believe that God has a purpose for everything, even if we don't understand it, than to think that we are at the mercy of random events. Calvin believed that God's presence in the world, His preservation and guidance, provide believers with comfort and assurance that God is always working, even when it seems like He is far away. Calvin's view of providence was not just about explaining why bad things happen. It was also about finding hope and trust in a world that can seem dark and threatening. He believed that God's care and control over creation were the only sure guarantees of a rational and just world. Even in the midst of chaos, Calvin encouraged believers to trust in God's wisdom and goodness, knowing that He is always at work, guiding and preserving His creation. As we look back through the pages of history, we see that the idea of angels has been a fascinating and sometimes controversial topic for Christians. From the early days of the Church to the time of the great theologian John Calvin, angels have played significant roles in Christian thought and practice. However, when we turn to Calvin's own writings, we find that angels aren't often the main focus. Despite this, they do appear from time to time, and when they do, they reveal some important aspects of Calvin's theology. Calvin was very careful when he talked about angels. He didn't want people to get too caught up in speculative ideas that weren't clearly taught in the Bible. For Calvin, it was essential to stick to what the scriptures said about angels and avoid making up stories or theories that weren't supported by the text. He was particularly concerned about the danger of people worshiping angels, which he saw as a form of idolatry. Instead, Calvin emphasized that angels were created by God to serve and protect his people, and that their ultimate purpose was to glorify God, not to be worshipped themselves. In his famous work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, Calvin mentions angels but doesn't go into great detail about them. He believed that angels were real and that they played a crucial role in God's plan. But he didn't want to speculate about their nature or functions beyond what the Bible clearly taught. For example, Calvin often spoke about how God had appointed angels to watch over and protect the church. He believed that angels were actively involved in the world, guiding and supporting believers, and that this was a source of comfort and strength for the faithful. Calvin's cautious approach to angelology was influenced by the broader Christian tradition, which had spent centuries debating various aspects of angelic nature and function. Early Christian writers like Justin, Clement, and Origen believed that angels had ethereal bodies, placing them between God and humans. They were seen as beings of a more spiritual nature than humans, but less spiritual than God. This idea was later refined by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, who argued that angels were completely spiritual and had no physical form at all. The creation and fall of angels were also significant topics in early Christian thought. Some believed that angels were created before the world, while others, like Augustine, argued that they were created at the same time as everything else. The reasons for the fall of some angels, particularly Lucifer, were also debated. Many believed that pride was the primary cause, with Lucifer trying to be like God and rejecting the grace that was offered to him. The good angels, on the other hand, were seen as being permanently confirmed in their goodness and unable to fall again. The role of angels in human affairs was another area of extensive discussion. Early Christians believed that angels were involved in many aspects of life, from delivering the law to the Jews to guiding and protecting individual believers. The idea of guardian angels, who were assigned to watch over specific individuals, became a popular belief. This idea was reinforced by biblical passages like Matthew chapter 18, verse 10, which suggests that angels are always in God's presence and are concerned with the well-being of children. Despite the rich tradition of angelic devotion, there were always concerns about the potential for idolatry. Church leaders, including St. Augustine, emphasized that while it was appropriate to love and honor angels, it was crucial to remember that only God should be worshipped. The cult of angels, which included practices like praying to angels or building shrines in their honor, was often criticized. Augustine's distinction between loving angels and worshiping God became a key teaching in the Church. By the time of the Middle Ages, the idea of a hierarchical structure among angels, as described by the Pseudo-Dionysius, became widely accepted. This hierarchy included 9 orders of angels, each with specific roles and functions. The highest orders, such as the cherubim and seraphim, were closest to God and were involved in the most spiritual activities, while the lower orders, like the angels, were more directly involved in human affairs. This structure influenced how people understood the roles of angels in the world and in their daily lives. Even as the Reformation began, the devotion to angels continued to be a part of Christian practice. Saint Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuits, for example, encouraged believers to imitate the purity of angels and to fight against evil spirits. The idea of guardian angels remained popular, and many people found comfort in the belief that they had a personal angel watching over them. In the end, Calvin's approach to angelology reflects his broader theological concerns. He wanted to ensure that the focus remained on God and the grace that He offers through Jesus Christ. While angels are part of God's creation and play important roles, Calvin believed that it was more important to understand and appreciate the work of God in the world and in our lives. By keeping his teachings on angels simple and biblically grounded, Calvin hoped to guide his followers away from the dangers of speculation and idolatry and toward a deeper faith in the living God.